So, you think you know the gold rush? A bunch of tough guys with pans, finding shiny rocks, and building America. That's a nice story. The real story is infinitely more stupid and 1,000 times more entertaining. It was a global festival of terrible ideas, where the grand prize for most people wasn't gold, but a bad case of scurvy and a lifetime of debt. Today, we're counting down 44 of the dumbest myths that fueled this magnificent disaster. 1. The just bend over and pick it up. Myth. The stories that started the gold rush were essentially the 19th century's version of a spam email promising you a fortune. Newspapers described California as a magical place where you didn't just find gold, you tripped over it. People genuinely imagined arriving, stretching their legs after a long journey, and then casually picking up enough gold to retire before their luggage was even unloaded. This single, hilariously wrong image convinced otherwise sane people to sell everything they owned for a fantasy that had less basis in reality than most fairy tales. The truth wasn't a leisurely stroll, it was a bad back, 10 broken fingernails, and the crushing realization that geology doesn't care about your dreams. 2. The nuggets the size of your head. Fantasy. Of course, a few genuinely enormous gold nuggets were found, and you can bet those stories were blasted through every newspaper on the planet. But the myth was that these finds were somehow common. Prospectors arrived fully expecting to unearth golden boulders, only to spend months with their faces inches from freezing mud, developing a permanent squint from staring at gravel and a personal relationship with a rock they named Steve. It's a classic case of lottery winner syndrome. People ignored the millions who lost, mesmerized by the one guy holding a chunk of metal so big it looked like a prop from a high school play about pirates. 3. The rivers paved with gold delusion. This one sounds like a level from a bad video game because it's just as fictional. The myth created an image of a glittering golden water park where you could just dip your pan in and pull out a fortune. The problem is a little thing called gravity. Gold is insanely heavy, meaning any real deposits would sink deep into bedrock cracks, not just hang out on the surface like glitter in a school art project. The only things paving most of these rivers were mud, disappointment, a few lost boots, and the skeletal remains of a mule that had a very, very bad day. 4. The fool's gold will make me rich. Blunder. Iron pyrite, nature's cruelest and most effective practical joke. You can just picture the scene. A desperate miner, after months of nothing, finds a huge, glittering chunk. He starts celebrating like he just invented electricity and plans his new mansion with a solid gold hat. He's the king of the world for a glorious 10 minutes, right up until some quiet, toothless old prospector takes the rock and crushes his dreams between two fingers like a bad Tinder date. The silence that followed wasn't golden. It was just incredibly, painfully awkward. 5. The any river in California has gold. Geographical myth. This is a classic case of spectacular geographical optimism. Prospectors looked at a map of California and basically saw it as a giant scratch-off lottery ticket where every single spot was a winner. They assumed gold was just evenly sprinkled across the entire state, like cinnamon on a latte. This led to miserable multi-month camping trips to nowhere, often led by a guy whose only qualification was being really, really sure of himself. They had a better chance of finding a decent cup of coffee in the wilderness than they did of finding gold in those barren, godforsaken canyons. 6. The gold grows back agricultural myth. This is my absolute favorite myth on this list because of its sheer, wholesome stupidity. This is what happens when you take a farmer who has only ever known corn and potatoes and put him in charge of geology. A surprising number of miners genuinely believed that gold was a crop. They thought if they found a good spot, they should leave a few small flakes behind as seeds, which would then grow into bigger nuggets. I'm sure some of them probably tried watering the spot and singing to it for good measure. Spoiler alert, you can't farm minerals. Geology is not impressed by your work ethic. 7. The magical shortcut through the mountains. Disaster. Before Google Maps could politely tell you that you're about to drive into a lake, there was this myth. Con artists, or sometimes just dangerously confident idiots, would sell maps to secret trails that promised to shave months off the journey. Desperate travelers would buy these maps, drawn by some guy in a saloon with a shifty look in his eye, and bet their lives on them. That easy pass the map promised usually turned out to be a 10,000-foot sheer cliff, or a delightful desert helpfully named something like the Devil's Anvil. 8. The relaxing cruise to riches. Nightmare. For those on the East Coast, this was sold as the 19th century equivalent of a luxury cruise commercial. Sipping brandy on the deck while you glide effortlessly toward your fortune. The reality was more like a 6-month-long floating prison, but with worse food. Imagine being trapped on an overloaded boat with hundreds of other seasick, desperate men, eating biscuits that could break your teeth, drinking questionable water, and listening to a constant chorus of men coughing up their lungs. It wasn't a shortcut to riches. It was a non-stop voyage to scurvy, storms, and profound regret. 9. The My Mule Knows the Way. Navigation tactic. This is what happens when you're so lost, you start looking to your lunch-stealing pack animal for spiritual guidance. Many prospectors, completely clueless about wilderness survival, developed a bizarre faith in their mules, believing the animals had some kind of innate GPS for finding gold, water, or safe passages. They'd let the mule wander off, convinced it was leading them toward destiny. In reality, the mule was leading them to a slightly more appealing patch of grass, or was simply trying to walk back to the last place it had a decent nap. It wasn't a spirit guide, it was just a donkey being a donkey. 10. The You Don't Need to Pack Much. Supply myth. This was a flat-out scam, basically the 19th century version of an influencer telling you to travel light, while also getting a commission on everything you buy at your destination. Merchants already in California spread this myth to create a captive audience of desperate, unprepared customers. People would arrive with little more than a pickaxe and a hopeful smile, only to find that a single egg cost the modern equivalent of a car payment. This myth didn't just lead to bankruptcy. It led to a lot of men suddenly discovering the agonizing symptoms of scurvy while paying a fortune for a rotten potato. 11. The My Amazing Land sailboat will get me there first. Myth. You have to admire the sheer, misguided genius of this one. Some prospectors, convinced they were smarter than everyone else, built wind wagons, which were literally sailboats with wheels. They genuinely believed they could hoist a sail and glide majestically across the prairies and deserts, leaving the suckers with their slow, boring oxen in the dust. The plan had only one tiny flaw. The wind is not a reliable employee. These contraptions usually ended up stranded and motionless in the middle of nowhere, looking like the abandoned set of a bizarre play, as a long line of oxen slowly plodded past them. 12. The Magic Gold-Finding Stick. Scam. Dowsing rods. When science fails you, why not try amateur wizardry? The ancient practice of dowsing, using a forked stick to find water, was given a shiny new upgrade for the gold rush. Con men sold specialized mineral rods that would supposedly twitch, bend, or point directly toward buried gold veins. You would see grown men wandering the hills for weeks, holding a stick out with intense concentration, following its every whim. It was geology by voodoo, a method that had the same success rate as just closing your eyes and digging randomly, but it made you look infinitely more ridiculous. 13. The patented gold magnet. Machine farce. The gold rush was a golden age for terrible inventions. Newspapers were filled with ads for incredible pseudo-scientific contraptions that promised to make you rich. The gold magnet was a fan favorite, despite the inconvenient scientific fact that gold is not magnetic. These machines were often complex tangles of gears and cranks that did absolutely nothing except make a hopeful noise. Buying one was like buying a diet water filter. Its only real demonstrable function was to efficiently separate a fool from his money, which, in a way, is its own kind of magic trick. 14. The secret Indian gold-finding technique. Myth. This was a lazy and condescending belief held by many white prospectors. They figured since Native Americans had been on the land for centuries, they must have a secret mystical cheat code for finding gold. They didn't bother learning geology, they just assumed the locals knew something they wouldn't share. This led to them either pestering local tribes for information they didn't have, or far more often, buying a secret map in a saloon from a guy who definitely wasn't a chief, which would lead them on a scenic tour of a completely worthless canyon. 15. The dynamite is the ultimate mining tool. Myth. When dynamite became available, it was like giving a toddler a sledgehammer to play with. Most miners had zero training and operated on the simple, glorious principle that a bigger boom means more gold. This led to some truly spectacular acts of stupidity. A favorite was trying to blast a riverbank to loosen the gold. The result wasn't a neat pile of nuggets. It was a deafening explosion that sent rocks, dirt, fish, and any potential gold flying into the next time zone. It was the least subtle and most destructive mining technique ever invented. 16. The Honorable Brotherhood of Miners. Fallacy. The myth paints the 49ers as a band of noble brothers, sitting around a campfire, singing songs and sharing their beans. The reality was more like a high-stakes, poorly regulated season of Survivor. The camps were cesspools of paranoia and betrayal. Claim jumping, which is a polite term for stealing someone's entire livelihood the second they turn their back, was a popular pastime. It wasn't a brotherhood. It was a chaotic free-for-all where your closest neighbor was also the person most likely to accidentally drop a rock on your head and take your claim. 17. The It's a Law-Abiding Adventure. Myth. People heard the term miners' courts and imagined some kind of dignified, organized process with a judge wearing a powdered wig. The reality was just mob rule with a fancy name, usually held in the nearest saloon. The jury was whoever happened to be the most sober, which was never a high bar to clear. There were no lawyers, no appeals, and no lengthy deliberations. Justice was swift, brutal, and often decided by who could shout the loudest. It was less a legal system and more a live-action version of a Reddit thread deciding someone's fate, but with a lot more ropes involved. 18. The My Canvas tent is a fortress housing myth. Prospectors, eager to start digging, constructed what can only be described as pathetic, cloth-based insults to the concept of shelter. They truly believed a simple canvas tent or a shack made of scrap wood was adequate protection. This flimsy fortress offered the structural integrity of a wet paper bag against flash floods, fires, and freezing mountain winds. And as for security, a thief didn't need to learn how to pick a lock. They just needed a small cheap knife to create a brand new custom-sized door wherever they pleased and walk out with all your stuff. 19. The camps are perfectly healthy. Sanitation myth. The quest for gold completely overshadowed the quest for, say, not dying from your own filth. Basic hygiene was treated as an optional luxury nobody had time for. The same river that provided your drinking water also served as the community's toilet, laundromat, and garbage disposal. The camps became a 5-star, all-inclusive resort for bacteria. Diseases like cholera and dysentery swept through these settlements with horrifying efficiency. The great irony of the gold rush is that the deadliest killer wasn't a grizzly bear or a bandit with a gun. It was an invisible germ in a contaminated cup of water. 20. The all you need is bacon and beans diet myth. The official Gold Rush diet plan was a monotonous culinary nightmare consisting of salted pork, beans, and rock-hard biscuits. Prospectors believed this was all a tough man needed to conquer the wilderness. What they didn't realize was that this diet was a perfect, scientific recipe for developing scurvy. Men would watch in horror as their gums began to bleed, their teeth loosened, and old scars mysteriously reopened. Their bodies were literally starting to uninstall themselves, all because they hadn't seen a piece of fruit since they left home. The tough guy diet was, in fact, the fastest way to become fatally weak. 21. The whiskey cures scurvy medical myth. This is a spectacular example of humanity's ability to solve a problem with the worst possible solution. Faced with the terrifying symptoms of scurvy and a complete lack of actual doctors, miners invented their own folk remedies. The most popular one, whiskey. Some argued it purified the blood, while others probably just figured that if your teeth are falling out, you might as well be too drunk to care. Of course, alcohol does absolutely nothing for a vitamin deficiency. It was like trying to put out a house fire with a flamethrower. A confident but catastrophically dumb idea. 22. The gambling is a smart investment. Financial myth. After a week of backbreaking labor that yielded a few grams of gold, the saloon's card table looked like a magical shortcut to success. Miners, convinced their luck was about to turn, would risk their entire findings on a single hand of cards. They saw it as an investment strategy. The professional gamblers who fleeced them saw it as a harvest. In the time it takes to shuffle a deck, a man's entire month of brutal, muddy work could vanish into the clean hands of a man who hadn't lifted anything heavier than a deck of cards all day. It was the express lane from poor to poorer. 23. The miners were the ones who got rich. Myth. This is the biggest lie of them all, the central pillar of the entire gold rush fantasy. The overwhelming majority of individual prospectors went completely broke or were lucky to leave with what they started with. The real money, the dynastic fortunes, were made by the people who mined the miners. Shrewd entrepreneurs like Levi Strauss, who sold durable pants, or Sam Brannan, who cornered the market on shovels and pickaxes. They understood that the real gold wasn't in the ground. It was in the pockets of the thousands of dreamers who needed stuff to dig with. 24. The gold dust is as good as cash. Myth. In the early days, paying for things with a pinch of gold dust from a pouch sounds incredibly cool and romantic. In practice, it was a system practically designed for getting ripped off. Every bartender and merchant had a scale, and it's shocking how many of those scales were rigged to favor the house. Bartenders were famous for their gold-catching, greasy fingers, or a long thumbnail that could snag a little extra with every pinch. It was a currency with a built-in scam fee, ensuring that every single transaction made you just a little bit poorer. 25. The your claim is your castle. Property myth. A miner would find a decent spot, hammer a few pathetic wooden stakes into the ground, and proudly declare it his kingdom. The problem was, this kingdom had the legal authority of a kid calling dibs on the last cookie. There was no sheriff to enforce your imaginary property lines. If a bigger, meaner group of miners decided they liked your spot, they didn't file a complaint. They just became your new, uninvited business partners, and your only job was to get out of their way before you got a shovel-shaped dent in your head. It was less property law and more the law of the jungle, but with more beards. 26. The "if I can bite it, it's gold" test. This has to be one of the dumbest, most iconic things people did. Because gold is a soft metal, the genius idea was that if you could sink your teeth into a nugget, it must be real. Con artists absolutely loved this. They'd take a lump of lead, which is even softer and also conveniently poisonous, give it a quick gold-colored paint job, and sell it to some poor sucker. The buyer would perform the famous bite test, proudly showing off his dental records on a worthless piece of metal, while the con man tried not to die laughing. It was the original taste test for financial ruin. 27. The "my gold is 100% pure." Purity myth. A prospector would show up to the buyer's office clutching his little pouch of gold dust, thinking every speck was pure, 24-karat magic. But nature isn't that generous. Natural gold is almost always mixed with less exciting things like silver or copper, basically nature's way of watering down the good stuff. The buyers, known as assayers, knew this perfectly well. They'd test the gold, give the miner a sad look, and explain how his treasure was mostly impurities. Then they'd pay him a fraction of what it was worth, knowing the poor guy had no other choice. 28. The buy your claim from a map in a saloon. Strategy. Imagine this. You're in a dimly lit bar, and a guy who looks like he sleeps in a ditch unrolls a map that looks like it was drawn by a child with a crayon. He tells you it's a secret map to a claim overflowing with gold. For the low, low price of everything you own, it can be yours. People actually did this. They'd hand over their life savings for a piece of paper that usually led them on a week-long hike to absolutely nowhere. It was the dumbest business deal imaginable, like buying a used car based on a dream you had. 29. The Klondike. It's just a little cold understatement. When gold was found in the Yukon, thousands rushed north. Many of these guys were from California, and their concept of cold was needing a light jacket in the evening. They heard warnings about the Arctic winter and just assumed it was an exaggeration. They showed up in Canada expecting a chilly camping trip and were introduced to a level of cold that can literally freeze your eyeballs. We're talking about temperatures where spit shatters when it hits the ground. It wasn't just a little cold. It was a full-time, life-ending assault by Mother Nature herself. 30. The Klondike. Stairs are already there. Chilkoot Pass myth. People heard about the golden stairs leading up the Chilkoot Pass and probably imagined a nice, sturdy staircase, maybe with a handrail. The reality was a single-file line of misery carved into a sheer wall of ice and snow by the boots of the guys in front of you. It wasn't a staircase. It was a vertical conga line of exhausted, freezing men, each carrying 100 pounds of gear. One slip didn't just mean you fell. It meant you started a human domino cascade of pure suffering. The name Golden Stairs was the cruelest joke of the entire Klondike rush. 31. The you only need a year's worth of food, Klondike rule. To stop people from immediately starving to death, the Canadian government made a rule. Every person had to bring 1 ton of supplies, a whole ton. People heard this and thought, okay, a checklist, I can do that. They completely failed to think about the next step. They had to haul that 1-ton mountain of bacon and beans up the side of a mountain, 50 pounds at a time, making dozens of trips back and forth. The rule wasn't just a packing list. It was a physical test designed to break you before you even started looking for gold. It was the world's worst grocery trip. Nair 32. The Australian gold is just like in California. Myth. When gold was discovered in Australia, many veteran American miners packed their bags and crossed the ocean, thinking they were the undisputed experts. They showed up full of swagger and tried all their California tricks like panning in rivers. The problem was, a lot of Australian gold was locked up deep underground in quartz rock. Their techniques were completely useless. You can just picture them, swishing their pans and getting nothing, while the local Aussie miners leaned on their pickaxes and had a good laugh. Their expertise had an expiration date, and it was somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. 33. The Deadwood is a heroic town. Myth. Black Hills Gold Rush. Thanks to television, we think of Deadwood as a gritty but somehow noble town full of charming outlaws and tough-as-nails pioneers. That's a great story. The less heroic reality is that the entire town was built on stolen land. The Black Hills were explicitly guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux people by a treaty. The gold rush wasn't a pioneering adventure. It was a massive, illegal home invasion. The heroes of Deadwood weren't brave settlers. They were just a bunch of guys who decided a piece of paper signed by the government didn't count if there was shiny stuff underneath it. 34. The bears are just big, shaggy dogs. Wildlife myth. A lot of prospectors were city boys whose closest encounter with wildlife was a particularly aggressive pigeon. They showed up in the mountains with a dangerously cute and cuddly view of nature. They'd leave food out, stumble around like they were in a city park, and assume a grizzly bear was just a big fluffy creature that you could probably reason with. This myth was usually corrected with terrifying speed and a distinct lack of reasoning. A grizzly bear is not a shaggy dog, and trying to pet one is a fantastic way to have your story end very, very abruptly. 35. The I'll just walk home rich in a few months delusion. This was the most heartbreaking myth of them all. Every single person left home with a movie playing in their head. They'd strike it rich, buy a huge hat, and return to their hometown as a hero. The possibility of total, crushing failure simply wasn't in the script. So when they inevitably failed, they were mentally broken. They were thousands of miles from home, with empty pockets and a mountain of shame. They couldn't afford the trip back and were too embarrassed to write home and admit they'd messed up. They just stayed, trapped by a fantasy that had completely dissolved. 36. The legendary lost mine is just over the next hill. Myth. Once all the easy gold was gone, a new, more mysterious myth was born: the story of the lost mine. It was always the same tale. A lone prospector finds a canyon literally filled with gold, but then conveniently gets amnesia, dies, or is abducted by aliens before he can tell anyone where it is. Legends like the Lost Dutchman mine kept the dream alive for decades, sending a whole new generation of fools on dangerous, obsessive quests, chasing rumors. They were hunting for a geological fairy tale, always convinced that unimaginable wealth was just one more sunburn away. 37. The "My gold nugget is a lucky charm." Superstition. This is a special kind of stupid, born from pure desperation. A miner would finally find one tiny solitary nugget after months of finding nothing. A smart person would trade it for food, a new pair of boots, or a ticket home. But not these guys. They'd convince themselves it was a lucky piece, a magical talisman that would lead them to more gold. Men were literally found starved to death, clutching a useless piece of rock in their hand that could have bought them a week's worth of meals. Their lucky charm was the unluckiest thing they ever found. 38. The mercury is a miner's best friend. Health myth. To get the tiniest flecks of gold out of dirt, miners used mercury. It was a miracle chemical that would bond with the gold, making it easy to collect. They thought of this highly toxic liquid metal as their helpful little buddy. They'd swish it around in pans with their bare hands, breathe in the poisonous fumes when they burned it off to release the gold, and generally treat it with all the caution of a toddler playing with water. They had no idea it was slowly destroying their nervous systems, giving them the shakes, and turning their brains into scrambled eggs. 39. The unlucky just didn't try hard enough. Meritocracy. Myth. This was the comforting lie the handful of winners told themselves to feel good. If you went home with nothing, it wasn't because you were unlucky or because the whole thing was a statistical sham. No, it was because you were lazy. You didn't have enough grit. It was a personal failure. This toxic idea was great for the egos of the few who stumbled into a fortune, but it just added a thick, heavy layer of shame to the utter misery of the 99% who had tried their absolute hardest and still had nothing to show for it but bad memories and worn-out boots. 40. The buried treasure. Maps are real. Myth. This myth is the stubborn, unkillable ghost of the gold rush. It's the belief that all those thousands of failed miners didn't just leave empty-handed. They secretly buried chests full of gold before they vanished. This spawned an entire industry of treasure hunters and con artists selling fake maps. For over a century, people have been wasting their time and money digging holes in the desert based on a piece of paper they bought online. They're chasing the mythical treasure of men who, in reality, probably didn't have enough gold to bury in a thimble. 41. There's still plenty of gold left for me second wave scam. Years after the easy gold was gone, a new myth was needed to lure in a fresh batch of suckers. Promoters and transportation companies would deliberately start rumors of new strikes in untouched territory. Newspapers would run headlines like, "The real gold rush is just beginning." It was a brilliant marketing campaign. A whole new wave of hopefuls would arrive, only to find the land was either picked cleaner than a Thanksgiving turkey or owned by a giant mining corporation that definitely wasn't hiring dreamers. 42. The gold rush was an American-only event. Myth. The classic image of the gold rush is always a white guy from Ohio with a big beard. But that's just a myth of convenience. The gold camps were one of the most ridiculously diverse places on the planet at the time. You had experienced miners from Mexico and Chile, thousands of immigrants from China who faced absolutely brutal racism, and adventurers from every corner of Europe and even Australia. It wasn't just an American fever dream. It was a global pandemic of gold madness, with people from all over the world coming to California to get poor together. 43. The My Kids Will Inherit a Fortune. Legacy. Myth. A lot of the men who rushed for gold weren't just thinking about themselves. They were thinking about their families. They had this grand vision of finding one good claim and setting their family up for generations. They imagined a future of wealth and ease, a dynasty built on a lucky find. But a gold claim wasn't a stable investment. It was more like a winning lottery ticket that expired in a month. Most of these men left their children nothing but a handful of debt and a collection of letters filled with broken promises. The golden legacy was just another part of the fantasy. 44. The gold rush ended myth. This is the biggest myth of all. We talk about the gold rush like it was a historical event that's over and done with. But it never really ended. The specific act of panning for gold in California faded away, but the psychological condition, that desperate, irrational belief in a magical shortcut to life-changing wealth, is a permanent feature of human nature. It just changes its costume. It became the dot-com bubble, then the housing crisis, and now it's crypto coins and meme stocks. The technology is different, but the dumb, hopeful, get-rich-quick myth is exactly the same as it ever was. So, the gold rush was less a story of brave pioneers and more a continent-wide comedy of errors. It proves that when you dangle the promise of easy money, humanity's capacity for wishful thinking is truly limitless. And that leads to the real question. Is that irrational, gold fever mentality a dangerous flaw in human nature? Or is it the very engine that drives innovation and builds nations, no matter how messy it gets? Argue about it in the comments. And while you're down there, demolish that like button and subscribe for more historical insanity.